thanks for joining today's live stream of my presentation about the migration of emancipated West Indians to Central America. After this presentation, feel free to go and watch some other videos on our channel. We have one on what is revival. That's very informative. There are a few from our February program about storytelling in Jamaica. So the migration of emancipated West Indians to Central America started in the mid-19th century after the abolition of slavery and the introduction of the oppressive systems by the planter class designed to keep the newly freed from becoming socially mobile. Many West Indians went to Central America in search of opportunities not available to them. This presentation will discuss why they left the Caribbean, how many went, and what countries they went to, what jobs they did, and their legacies in these Latin American countries. All right, so first we'll talk about why the West Indians had to leave. So as I previously stated, that after the abolition of slavery, the planters still felt as though they had a right to the labor of the freed slaves. And since they know how to pay the slaves, their profits went down. So they tried all means to ensure that they would still be making a profit. They had a hard time reconciling that those who were once viewed as property were now free citizens just as they were, and at every turn they came up with ways to keep the ex-slaves tied to the plantation in a sort of pseudo-servitude. The newly freed slaves were faced with the reality that even though they were now free men, there were still systems in place that prevented their upward social mobility. This included no proper education system was established for the freed and their children, high land prices in certain situations, they were not even allowed to purchase land. Cities became more populated with those migrated from rural areas in search of work. When they did manage to find work, the wages were low and not sufficient to properly provide for them and their families. To reduce the cost of labor, the planters abolished allowances such as free medical care, housing, and provision grounds that would have previously been used as an additional source of income by the enslaved. The planters preferred to import cheap labor from other parts of the British Empire than to increase the wages of the freed blacks already living there. So they brought in labor from East Asia mostly, and that can still be seen in the population of the West Indies. They also brought in labor to a smaller degree from other European countries. So faced with these obstacles, the newly freed population needed to find a new way to provide for themselves and their families. Migrating to Central America provided the perfect opportunity to move away from the oppressive plantation systems, as well as to earn money to improve the lives for them and their families. All right, so the migration started at around 1850 and went on for the next 100 years, or approximately 100 years. So between 1850 and 1950, it is estimated that over 200,000 West Indian laborers traveled to Panama alone. Costa Rica saw the migration of 20,000 Jamaicans between the 1900 and 1930. The earliest set of migrants consisted mainly of single men who were then followed by older family men who would work and send money back for their family. Some came back, but others would eventually bring their families to live in Central America and created a whole new society. All right. So there are three main instances of migration. So it started with the building of the Panamanian Railroad between 1849 and 1855. Then the building of the infamous Panama Canal, which started in 1881 and finally ended in 1914. And then they also went to work on United Fruit Company plantations in Costa Rica. All right, so first we're going to talk about the Panamanian Railroad. So after gold was discovered in California, there needed to be a faster route to travel from the east coast of the United States of America to the west coast of the United States of America. There were steamships, but because they had to go, the route was slower than, and the land route was also slower. So they need to find a faster sea route. So previously, the U.S. had gained rights to the Isthmus of Panama, and this is when they had come up with the steamship company so one ship would take from the eastern side of America down to the Isthmus, and another ship would collect those passengers and take them from the Pacific side up to California. However, there was still need for a faster route. So the construction of the Panamanian Railroad began in 1849 and was the first instance of West Indian migration to Central America. Now, 1849 is just about 10 years after the end of the apprentice system and 14 years after the abolition of slavery. So those who went to Panama for the construction of the Panamanian Railroad would have definitely been ex-slaves, freed slaves. The project needed a large workforce, which Panama could not provide. The Panamanian Railroad Company hired Chinese immigrants at first. However, due to illness, their stay in Panama was short-lived. Europeans were also recruited, but they could not provide the volume of workers that were needed. This is when recruiters shifted their focus to the West Indies, which was much closer for recruiters and transportation costs were low. During the initial constructions, recruiters would go to the islands, but after a while, the West Indians, they started coming on their own because they were promised better wages and better living conditions. So what did they have to lose? However, when they got there, they were confronted with a very difficult reality. When they arrived, low wages, deplorable living conditions, diseases, and a rugged, inhospitable terrain was what met them. When the railroad project was completed, some of the workers, West Indian workers, did stay in Panama. Some of them migrated further up north in Central America to seek work, and others came back to the West Indies. In 1881, the Panama Canal, construction of the Panama Canal began. So during the first construction of the canal, workers were contracted from the West Indies, but they had proven that they were more capable. During the first construction of the canal, workers were contracted from the West Indies because they had proven from the railroad project that they were more suitable workers than other migrant laborers. From around 1879 to 1890, as much as 50 Black West Indian documented workers arrived in Panama to work for the France, which is the first contractor for the Panama Canal. On the France, which was the first attempt on the canal connecting the Atlantic and the Pacific Ocean. The second importation of workers not only affected the numerical but racial composition of the Itmos that can still be seen today. Most of the workers came back from Jamaica, followed by Barbados, St. Lucia, and Martinique. In 1884, more than half of the 19,000 documented workers employed were West Indian. Of the 12,875 West Indians contracted in 1885, 9,000 of them came from Jamaica. But after the failure of the initial French project, approximately 20,000 West Indians were left stranded on the Itmos. Some West Indians were repatriated, but many stayed and formed communities in Panama. When the Americans took over the construction in 1904, they absorbed workers who were still under contract by the French. Official records show that by 1906, there were 30,000 West Indians in the employment of the Americans. And in 1913, at the peak of recruiting, there were 44,711 unskilled laborers, and 40,000 of them were West Indian. However, unofficially, there was over 200,000 men and women who migrated from the West Indies to work on the construction of the canal. Both men and women worked. Mostly you'd see men as the laborers, and women would do domestic work or work in the offices. In the case of the United Fruit Company, migration began because of the explosion of the banana business. After initially buying banana crops from Afro-Caribbean farmers who pioneered the cultivation of banana in Central America, which they sold to U.S. exporters after the construction of the Panamanian Railroad was completed, the United Fruit Company began establishing their own large banana plantations in the turn of the 19th to 20th century. The expansion called for more land as well as labor. They had first attempted to import workers from Asia and Europe. However, just like in the case of the railroad, these workers were not suited for our climate, and they could not do the level of work that West Indian laborers could. So once again, they turned to the West Indies to get labor. In the region where banana production was expanded, the population was sparse, and the Puerto Ricans living there did not want to work on the plantations. They claimed that the Atlantic coastal region was too unhealthy for them, and it was likely that the meager wages was really the issue. Just like the railroad and the canal construction, the United Fruit Company needed a large labor force, and it led them to the West Indies. Similarly, in Panama, the importation of West Indies migrant workers led to the decomposition of the demographic composition of Costa Rica, specifically in the province of Limon, where even today the population is largely made up of descendants of West Indian migrants who went there generations before. By 1910, the Jamaican community in Limon had developed a complex social life of churches, newspapers, mutual societies, and lodges, all outside of the United Fruit Company control. They formed organizations and outside of the confines of the banana plantation, ensuring that their unique cultural practices were survived. More than 100 years after the first West Indian migrated to Central America in an attempt to distance themselves from the legacies of the oppressive system of slavery that affected their upward mobility and success, there remained a thriving Afro-Caribbean presence in both Panama and Costa Rica, having carved a new life for themselves. Though they assimilated into Latin American society, and way of life many years later, their descendants still identify as Caribbean people. In Costa Rica, there is still a thriving community of Jamaican descendants spanning 3 generations living in Limon, particularly. Journalists have traveled to Central America to interview descendants of West Indians, specifically those who descended from Jamaican migrants. Some of these descendants speak Jamaican dialect, speak Patois, along with Spanish, and still hold on to their Jamaican roots, customs, and traditions, even though they have never been to Jamaica. Panama also has distinctly Afro-Caribbean communities in places like Colon, Cristobal, and Cristobal, and these communities have been keeping the Caribbean tradition alive for future generations. This is the end of my presentation. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to ask.